We'd like to warmly welcome everybody to this evening's seminar. Our speaker, Ian Stewart from Queen Mary University, London. The theme of Ian's presentation this evening is Celticism, an intellectual and cultural history. Ian is a historian of Western Europe, including Britain and Ireland, primarily in the 18th and 19th centuries. He received his PhD in history from the London School of Economic and Political Science in 2017 for a thesis on Celticism and national thought in the long 19th century. Since 2019, since January 2019, he's been a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the School of History at Queen Mary University of London, where he's working on a project about the history of linguistics within the wider history of knowledge. He's interested particularly in the intellectual histories of nationalism and race, as well as the histories of Celticism and linguistics. All of these topics will feature in this evening's paper, but his articles can be found in the journals of Past and Present, French History, and History of Science, among other places. So a very warm welcome to you, Ian, and we very much look forward to hearing your paper. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak, and thank you for allowing me to speak in my native language. I can only read Welsh, and unfortunately I can't really speak it. So, but I deeply admire the Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies at Aberystwyth, and so it's a real honour to be here and to be addressing, you know, maybe the finest group of Celticists in the world at the Centre. But it's slightly terrifying because I'm not a Celticist. I'm a historian of the modern period, and I'm especially interested in the intellectual and cultural histories of Britain, Ireland, and France. But one of the reasons that I really enjoy the study of Celticism is because it's a link that connects the histories of these nations and ideas quite firmly. So the title of the paper is Celticism, an Intellectual and Cultural History, but that is in effect the subject of a book that I've been writing for, I mean, basically since I started the PhD, and which is under contract with Princeton and hopefully will be published in a couple of years. So in this paper, I'm going to take you through some of the overarching arguments and highlight some areas where I think I'm making a new contribution. Your feedback would, of course, be really welcome. But I'd like to start with this map, which was published at Blaenau Festiniog in 1898 by a man named Fournier. He was a physicist who led the Pan-Celtic movement around 1900, and I'll speak more about him later. But this map is boldly titled Celtia, and it's an imagined community. It's shaded according to the concentration of Celtic speakers in a particular area, and it pays no attention to the contemporary borders of the United Kingdom, and you'll see that England isn't even labeled. So I came across this map as a master's student in 2012, and it's intrigued me ever since. And after writing my MA thesis on the cultural politics of Celticism and the land question in the Highlands in the 1880s, I began a PhD on the topic of Pan-Celticism, which is the idea that underpins this map. And so I fairly quickly wrote a chapter on this group called the Celtic Association, which was the first Pan-Celtic group at the beginning of the 20th century. But I struggled to find much more work about where the idea of the Celts came from and why it mattered so much to people in the 19th century. And I'm putting it in terms like these because at the time, I was firmly under the influence of the invention of tradition paradigm, but I now recognize that that doesn't really hold up in the case of the Celtic nations as neatly as perhaps some would hope. But you'll be shocked to hear that the London School of Economics didn't have many or any Celticists. So I stumbled around in the dark on my own for a few years, but decided to make this larger question about Celticism the subject of my thesis. And so what I came to realize is, and what everyone here will know this already, is that Celts and things Celtic are of perennial interest in academic and popular culture. And this is despite the fact that there is still a hazy understanding of the peoples called Celts in antiquity, and that there is considerable disagreement today over whether the modern Celtic nations and their cultures bear any direct or particular relation to their purported ancient forebears. So I grew up in America, and these are the sorts of Celtic associations one could expect to find. This Celtic on Main Street is actually a store a few blocks away from my parents' house. But over here, some commercially minded authors like to suggest that the Celts are a lost people that we might discover if we search for them hard enough. But if books published in English are anything to go by, then we probably don't need to look very hard, because there seems to be more and more published all the time. And most of these books, I'm amazed at how many of them are published, sort of in English, but also in the major European languages. They repeat the same information over and over, some of which is badly outdated. But there are good overviews of the ancient Celts, and most will contain a chapter or two dedicated to the ways in which ideas of the Celts inspired modern literary, religious, and cultural movements, and became foundational components of national identities in modern Britain, in the nations of modern Britain, Ireland and France. But these accounts are usually highly impressionistic and either trace out the reception of ancient ideas without really contextualizing them within their modern contexts, or they focus on how genuine ancient or medieval evidence was used in modern fabrications. So some of the greatest hits that a reader might be treated to in these are, for just to take some random ones, for example, are the linguistic ideas of Edward Llwyd, James Macpherson in the Poems of Ossian. There might be a fleeting note about Walter Scott and the role he played in popularizing a kitsch Celticism when he organized George IV's visit to Edinburgh in 1822. The achievements of Johann Caspar Zeuss in linguistics will probably be discussed, but as unspecifically as possible. And at the end, perhaps, Yeats and the Celtic Twilight, or the Gaelic League, or some element of the Irish literary revival before 1916 will also feature. And these are usually covered quite sparingly, and understandably so, because the author of these is usually a specialist in medieval history or literature, or in ancient archaeology. And more emphasis is given to the diachronic filiation of ideas than to the synchronic context in which they appeared during later periods. So straightforwardly, my approach is to take the modern manifestations of the Celts, of ideas of the Celts, as my central focus. So my book will show that from about the 16th century onwards, the Celts became one of the most popular ancestral choices in Europe. So over the next few centuries, scholars from most European nations claimed Celtic ancestry for their peoples at one point or another, and they fought in the Republic of Letters over the claim to the purest Celtic provenance. And the Celts featured in the great intellectual shifts that resulted from movements like the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and political upheavals like the French Revolution. The 19th century onset of nationalism and racialism invested ancestral origins with even more weight and found an important place for the Celts in the developing identities of different European nations. Yet by the middle of the 19th century, the Celts had, for the most part, been intellectually and physically relegated to the fringes, quote unquote, of Western Europe as apparent victims of political impotence and racial prejudice. But if the idea of who could claim to be a Celt became clearer, the European power of that idea had dramatically weakened, and it has arguably been in decline ever since, despite 20th century events like the Irish Revolution and the rise of separatist nationalisms in Scotland, Wales, and Brittany. But the idea of the Celts has also proved remarkably resilient, And it is perhaps the lack of a certain kind of political import behind it that ironically allowed the Celts to weather the 20th century. So if one can still proudly and publicly identify as a Celt, the same can't be said for the Anglo-Saxons, the Teutons, or the Aryans, for example. And I think it's worth thinking about why that is, and that the best way to understand it is through an intellectual and cultural history. So just to quickly cover my approach to Celticism, I adopt Joop Leerson's definition that Celticism is not the study of the Celts and their history, but rather the study of their reputation and of the meanings and connotations ascribed to the term Celtic. Because the Celts are, and have always been to a certain extent, constructions. So especially in the modern era, the images of the Celts have been held together by much interpretative glue. And this is neither to say that the Celts are simply invented or imagined, nor that they are primarily the product of an identitarian center's need for a peripheral other. It's rather to claim that the images of those peoples and cultures that have been called Celtic are the result of more than 2.5 millennia's worth of negotiation in different places and cultures with different kinds of evidence. And so while some of the more doctrinaire, Celtiskeptics see the obvious modern construction of the Celts as the smoking gun that makes their case, the notion that the Celts have to some extent always been a construction, this wouldn't be much of a surprise to a classical author, nor to the founders of Celtic studies, all of whom were only too aware of the patchy evidential record. And so for a historian of the modern period, the greatest problem with the Celtiskeptic discussion is not this constructed picture of the Celts. It's that Celticism is presented as this sort of sterile product of academic debates and scholarly paradigm shifts that are mostly methodological in character. The barrier, of course, between scholarly and public imaginings of the Celts has been extremely porous, but it's normally assumed to go only one way, and that's from scholarship into the public sphere. So that tracking Celticism has mostly been done by following the professionalization of Celtic studies and the rise of disciplines like modern linguistics and archaeology. My approach, on the other hand, takes popular attitudes and ideas as seriously as it does the academic debates, and it seeks to show how these two things shaped each other. To just take one example, this becomes really clear in the 19th century, when theories of race underpinned high and low conceptions of the Celts. So essential figures in the history of Celticism like Ernest Renan, Matthew Arnold, Douglas Hyde, and in his own way, W.B. Yeats, all straddled the line between private scholar and public moralist. Their work was suffused with racial theory, which obviously shaped their conceptions of the Celts. And the theories of all four shaped understandings of the Celtic nations well into the 20th century. So that racial shadow really hovers over, I think, the field, even if it isn't put in those terms well into the 20th century. So I argue that it was neither the professionalization of archaeology, nor Zoysian comparative linguistics, nor even the inception of Celtic studies itself that was the most important development in the history of Celtic ideas, or ideas of the Celts, but the onset of national thought and race theory from the end of the 18th century. And so these provided the really wide conceptual landscapes within which old and new ideas were interpreted. So that's my preamble, my long preamble done, and I'll just walk you through the major outlines of the book, and I'll focus in particular on two chapters. The first is the first stages of the professionalization of Celtic comparative philology in the early 19th century and the Pan-Celtic movement around 1900. And I'm going to walk over part one superficially because much of this material will already be familiar to you, but I'll refer you to some of my articles if you'd like to read further about particular aspects of this. Okay, so the first question is, why would an early modern author study the Celts? Well, because the ideas of the Celts featured quite heavily in early modern European discussions about nations and history. But the influence of ideas of the Celts was indirect because no one called themselves Celts and there was no Celtic nation. Instead, the Celts were seen as prestigious ancestors whose legacy was up for grabs if it could be proven that a modern nation or city or region descended from them. And so to assert Celtic lineage in the 16th or the 17th century was to make a political claim to be descended from one of the earliest known European peoples, whose conquests had stretched from Iberia to Asia Minor. And establishing these claims required the tools of scholarship: textual philology, linguistic comparison, the study of physical remains, which we would call archaeology, and the collection of supposed remnants of Celtic culture, folklore, or poetry. Okay, so with these tools, how did an early modern scholar study the Celts? Well, as I outlined in the first chapter, the most obvious way was to read what the classical authors had said about them. The recovery of Greek and Roman texts by philologists and the dawn of printing made it easier for scholars to gather credible information about antiquity, and as a result of this, the medieval myths of descent from Trojans, Scythians, or Phoenicians were gradually discarded, though they died really hard in Ireland. But those classical accounts of the Celts are often vague at best and contradictory at worst. So for example, two of the most significant Roman ethnographies of Northern Europe, Caesar's Gallic Wars and Tacitus's Germania, both allude to the relationships of the Gauls, part of whose territory was called Celtica, with the Britons and the Germans, but they leave their ethnic affiliations undetermined. So a millennium and a half later, after these authors were writing, that gray area would lead to really acrimonious disputes between French and scholars who spoke the Germanic languages. And a few centuries after that, those classical accounts would provide some of the negative stereotypes that were employed at the height of modern Franco-German antagonism in the age of high nationalism in the 19th century. So I stress this here because it's really important for us to study ideas that seemed that were influential in their time, but that seem laughable to us now. Because by studying many of those wrong terms, we can understand what certain authors were thinking, and eventually how the sort of right ideas about who the Celts were came about. Because this scholarly quarrel between the French and the Germans began in the 15th century and ran for about 400 years. It revolved primarily around language and whether ancient Gaulish or ancient German had been spoken by the Celts, or whether ancient Gaulish was actually Germanic, or whether the German dialects were actually Celtic. And so there were many variations of these ideas and lots of semantic slippage. And it's this confusion that provides the essential context in which Johann Caspar Zeuss composed the Grammatica Celtica. Okay, so language, I'm moving on to my summary of the second chapter. Language preserved in place names, personal names, recorded ancient words, and in the still living Celtic tongues, form the main pillar of investigation into the identity of the ancient Celts for most of the early modern period. And as I outlined in the second chapter, the debate between Pezeran, Fluid, and Leibniz sort of shaped the debate through the 18th century. I've written about this in an article in Past and Present about linguistic antiquarianism, but in Sense Learning to Read Welsh, I now rely on Carol Davies's excellent book, Ad Felian Babel, the best history of linguistic study, I think, in 18th century Britain, even though it focuses primarily on Wales. Yet, and this is moving on to chapter 3, many scholars didn't know the Celtic languages or were under mistaken opinions about them. So figures like John Aubrey and William Stukely pioneered what we would call archaeological approaches to monuments like Stonehenge, which many believe to be Druidic temples. And in this section, I draw on the new and exciting work by Marianne Constantine and Nigel Leask, who've shown that travelers sought out these monuments and often read classical passages about the Druids and about the presence of ancient Britons in them. But there was little attention paid to physical monuments by James Macpherson in the works of Ossian, or in his introduction to the history and antiquities of Great Britain that he wrote about 10 years after that. And this provided the spark which set off an antiquarian civil war between the different nations of Britain and Ireland. So all of whom were writing against Macpherson and the Scots to some extent. That's the subject of chapter 4. But finally, at the end of the 18th century, the onset of the French Revolution made space for the Celtic Gauls to triumph over the Germanic Franks as a dominant origin myth for La Nation in France. Even if there was little space for the use of historical argument by the French revolutionaries, who based their arguments on the philosophic principle of national rights and not on inherited historical traditions or constitutions. Yet under the Napoleonic Empire, the Académie Celtique was founded as an antiquarian society dedicated to investigating the Celtic origins of the French through language and physical monuments. And just my article on the right is in French history, and I can discuss much more about the revolutionary context or the Napoleonic context in the questions if you like. But for now, I will move on to part 2, which focuses on the idea of race. And I argue in this section that the inception of racial theory completely transformed ideas of the Celts in 19th century Europe. So people in the Celtic nations who spoke the Celtic languages began to be treated as a distinct population, naturally different from the Germanic nations next to whom they lived. So for the Celts, this meant that a particular set of qualities like sensitivity to nature or emotional volatility was thought to correspond with particular face shapes, with skull forms, with stature, and hair and eye coloring, and also, of course, skin color. And according to the logic of 19th century racialism, because of their natural racial characters, the Celtic nations had to be governed differently from other populations and were frequently portrayed as needing to be civilized by the Anglo-Saxons. And I'll talk a bit more about these sorts of dynamics, and I can do some of the questions, but I'd just like to focus on my 6th chapter, which is a new account of the emergence of Celtic comparative philology. Because those investigating the Celtic languages at the outset of the 19th century faced a real problem. Did the Celtic race belong to the larger Indo-European group that was emerging through comparative linguistic study? And I'll just stress that at the time, the overwhelming way of determining racial affiliations was to determine whether their languages were affiliated. And this is true, from the time of the Renaissance and even before that. So although William Jones had suggested in 1786 in his famous lecture that Celtic was likely related to Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, Old Persian, and Gothic, this assertion had remained unproven because Jones himself wasn't really interested in language as such. And so he left it undone at his death. And even though H.T. Colebrook, his successor, accepted Jones's suggestion about Celtic, it still remained unproven in print. Not only that, but it was actively opposed by scholars like John Pinkerton, like Konrad Maltebrunn, and the German philological giant A.W. Schlegel. This was the most significant opposition to this idea. And they were reacting against what they saw as Celtomania, which I can talk about more in the questions if you want. But to make a long story short, Celtic was finally vindicated in 1831 as an Indo-European language by a man named James Cowles Pritchard. Pritchard was a physician by trade, but he's remembered chiefly as a scholar and particularly as the founder of ethnology in Britain. This was a field he began to popularize around 1840, and it became one of the main race sciences in Britain. Pritchard was born to a Welsh mother close to Wales, and he took a special interest in Welsh history and its language. And so both Edward Celtic Davies and Iolo Morgannwg stayed with the family in Bristol. And Pritchard later reminisced to Iolo's son Taliesin about time spent, quote, in the society of your excellent father, who was my much esteemed friend. And like Davies and Iolo, Pritchard was keen to hit back against the Scots and against James Macpherson and anyone depriving the Welsh of their title of ancient Britons, because Macpherson had claimed that the Highlanders were the true Celts and the original inhabitants of Britain and Ireland. So I'll talk about this in a bit, but Pritchard remained connected to Welsh cultural circles, and he participated in some of the first of the reignited Eisteddfodi of the, I'm sorry about my pronunciation, of the Abergavenny Welsh Society in the late 1830s and 1840s. Okay, and I'm talking about Pritchard because for a long time, modern Celtic linguistics was thought to begin with Zeus, and that Celtic studies more generally began with Zeus also. And it's only in the last few decades that scholars like Eric Poppa have shown that there was an earlier generation of scholars who proved the Indo-European credentials of Celtic. Though I have to stress, without the older forms of the languages, which distinguished Zeus's work, of course. So Pritchard was actually the first one to prove in print that the Celtic languages were indisputably Indo-European in his 1831 work, The Eastern Origin of the Celtic Nations, proved by a comparison of their dialects with the Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and Teutonic languages. But as early as 1813, Pritchard had written in his first ethnological work that the languages of the Slavic, German, and the Latin races were, quote, so far allied in their radical elements that we may with certainty pronounce them to be branches of the same original stock. And here he was adding Celtic, well aware of the fact that this was opposed, or at least unproven by European scholars. And so he added in a footnote that he was about to publish a work of Celtic philology to prove it. So he discussed an article by a man named Alexander Hamilton, who had shown through comparative tables that Sanskrit, Persian, Latin, and the Gothic languages comprised this relationship that sat at the beginning, or sat at the foundation of the Indo-European language family. But he said this proof would have been much more striking if the Celtic and Slavic languages and the Greek had been added. He said he'd already composed a work and he intended to shortly publish it. But that work never appeared, or at least not until 1831, by which time the major developments in Germanic comparative philology had taken place. So Bopp, Rask, and Grimm had all published major works. And in his work of 1831, Pritchard followed Bopp's method, and he'd conversed at this point with Jacob Grimm in Göttingen. And so the consensus has basically been that Pritchard produced his 1831 work as a result of learning German comparative grammar. But there's a new source from 1815 in which the information on the Celtic languages that Pritchard produces largely resembles the first half of his work of 1831. And none of this relies on Germanic style comparative grammar. And I mean, Bopp's first major work in 1816 hadn't been published yet, so Pritchard was really doing this on his own. So this was a review of Adelung and Vater's Mithridates, which was a linguistic catalog published in the first decades of the 19th century. In the review, Pritchard pointed out the obvious similarities in vocabulary and grammar between Celtic and the other European languages and Sanskrit. So, I mean, he gives a table of numbers here, obviously, and I think this is a pretty early example of one of these tables. Now, he had already indicated in his Latin dissertation of 1808 that grammatical comparisons were much more important than lexical comparisons. And so he showed that, that the verb in Welsh, in Latin, and Sanskrit all conjugated according to the same principles or similar principles. He'd also noticed, apparently on his own, that Welsh and Sanskrit shared the principle of what's called in Sanskrit sandhi, in which certain, terminations of consonants altered the first consonant of the subsequent word for euphonic purposes. And obviously this is why the Celtic languages have initial mutations. So, to sum up here, Pritchard had come to the conclusion that Celtic was Indo-European and had proven it with some pretty advanced methods long before he was able to read the early important works of the continental scholars. He essentially repeated these methods in 1831, but he added an example of pronouns that he derived mostly from Bopp. But he stated directly that the central question of his inquiry of that work was to prove whether the Celtic dialects belonged to the class of languages for which the term Indo-European is the most suitable designation. And he said that this work was undertaken in order to, quote, illustrate the relation of the Celtic people to the rest of mankind. So before this, the Celts had been sort of adrift, but Pritchard was proving that they were, they were part of this larger Indo-European race, which he, which are the terms that he used. And so I'd just like to make a historiographical point here, which is that Pritchard's otherwise very reliable biographer, Hannah Augustine, said that Pritchard's work was ignored, that it wasn't really picked up in Britain, and that it was completely ignored on the continent. And this isn't really true. So scholars and scientists like William Wool, like Thomas Arnold, and E.B. Tyler in Britain all identified Pritchard as the first to prove Celtic's Indo-European credentials. And Pritchard garnered similar praise from European scholars. So perhaps most importantly, Jakob Grimm appreciated the work, and shortly after Pritchard published it, he reviewed it, and he said that Pritchard had, without doubt, proven Celtic to be a division of the Indo-European family. He'd shown it more clearly than ever before. And in Rome, the young Irish Catholic and the future Bishop of Westminster, Nicholas Wiseman, he lauded Pritchard's work in his influential lectures on the connection between science and revealed religion. He said that Pritchard had put this matter at rest. And the positive reception of Wiseman's lectures in Ireland meant that Pritchard's influence would be felt there indirectly, in a decade where the Celtic question was becoming firmly answered. And the Phoenician explanation of Irish origins was finally cast aside. But moving away from Pritchard and staying on Ireland for a moment, I'd just like to talk about race in the context of national thought and prejudice in the 19th century. So it's well known that the problems of the Union of 1801 were blamed by some commentators on Celtic racial deficiency. This explanation still features in the historiography, but the obvious problem with this is that it reduces the British-Irish relationship to a rigid Saxon-Celtic dichotomy. But Britain wasn't simply England, and Ireland wasn't the only Celtic nation. So there were a range of responses around Celticism. And so, for example, the French political theorist Gustave de Beaumont, who recognized the racial affinity of the Irish and the French, was anxious, of course, to blame the problems of the famine on English conquest, tyranny, and misrule. and those from other Celtic nations identified other factors that had nothing to do with race. And so in 1866, the North Wales Chronicle, a Methodist paper, posed the question, quote, "Is Fenianism essentially Celtic?" And the answer was emphatically negative. Quote, "The Irishman, we repeat, is not a rebel because he is a Celt, but solely because he's a papist." And sentiments like this forced the Catholic Lord Acton, who's a liberal, to paint the problem as a racial one. He said that the Celts are not among the progressive initiative races. So while anti-Celtic racism provided a key idiom with which to explain political problems with the Union, taking a closer look at the rhetoric of Celticism shows that in general, it was a greater sin to be Irish than to be Celtic. The Welsh and the Highlanders were subjected to nowhere near the same level of opprobrium during their own political agitations. So while anti-Irish prejudice often overlapped with anti-Celtic racism, it was no means driven by it. And the point of wider importance here is to guard against one-size-fits-all approaches that reduce complex historical relations to self-other dichotomies. Okay, so moving on to my third pan-Celtic section, the ubiquity of 19th century racial thought meant that a coherent image of the Celts was ripe for plucking by Saxon chauvinists. There's no denying that. But race as an idea was also available to those who were beginning to identify as Celts themselves in a nascent pan-Celticism. Now, pan-Celticism hasn't received that much attention from scholars, though I think some, or if not all, of the authorities are based at the Celtic Center. So this part of the book asks questions about why and how pan-Celticism emerged, where and when it did, who it attracted and what they hoped to achieve. And it does this by setting these movements within the wider British and European contexts. So to define pan-Celticism, I call it the recognition that the modern Celtic nations share a common descent and should organize culturally and politically on that basis. But this recognition took time. And so although the two language branches, Brittonic and Gaelic, were mutually unintelligible, and although national customs differed greatly, and that anything resembling shared history lay far outside the bounds of living memory, the idea of race actually allowed members of Celtic nations a new and scientific grounding in which to explore and justify their affinity. But by necessity, pan-Celts had to invent memories and borrow traditions. And so, ironically, despite the Irish suffering the most anti-Celtic racial abuse during the 19th century, Wales in this period had probably the strongest Celtic cultural movement. And this has been analyzed most recently in Coivin de Barra's book, The Coming of the Celts. The Welsh language was in excellent health, and there was, of course, a robust medieval manuscript tradition that scholars from the other Celtic nations relied on for clues of what their own ancestors might have looked like. And that's why my first chapter is upon nos ancêtres les Gallois, because a number of French scholars were interested in the history of Wales and came over to look at Welsh manuscripts because they thought that this might provide the best picture of their own Gaulish ancestors, because the Gauls notoriously had no text of their own, no medieval survival of their ancient culture. But something more than just scholarship and ideas were needed to reify the ideas advanced. And so, like most other commentators, I see the Abergavenny Eisteddfod of 1838 as the real beginning. And so I'm sure the general story here is quite familiar. First, the two language branches recognize common kinship. And while Franco-Breton and Welsh fellow feeling was alive from the 1830s, it took longer for a similar sympathy to arise between cultural revivalists in the Highlands and those in Ireland. And this came about principally through political agitation in the land question of the 1870s and 80s. But towards the end of the 19th century, these various movements recognized their affinity, and a genuine Pan-Celticism finally emerged. But even so, as Deborah stresses, narrow nationalism always trumped cosmopolitan Pan-Celtic idealism, but still some interesting things happened. And Pan-Celticism shifted into high gear in the late 1890s under the direction of this man, who was an English physicist named Edmund Edward Fournier Daub. This section is based firmly on archival sources, but especially on his personal papers, which are pictured here. They are kept by Fournier's granddaughter in the southwest of France. And I was fortunate to be able to view them in her house a few years ago. Okay, so Fournier was born in London in 1868, and he was schooled in Germany. He returned to London and attended the Royal College of Science, but he settled in Dublin in the early 1890s, where he was a physicist by day, but a cultural nationalist by night. So he joined the major groups like the Gaelic League, but after hearing Welsh spoken on a trip to Wales in 1896, he described his conversion to what he called a Celtic faith, which, quote, "I have found the source of the greatest inspiration of my life." And so he began to organize a Pan-Celtic Congress. And he secured the participation of leading Irish figures like W.B. Yeats and Patrick Pearse. And this was obviously significant because these two were from competing movements, one in English, the other in Irish, one sort of predominantly Protestant, and the other that had a very strong Catholic core. So might Pan-Celticism's emphasis on race and shared history and language be enough to transcend these splits? Well, Fournier certainly hoped so. And so the stage was set for the inaugural Pan-Celtic Congress in Dublin in 1901. This is a masterclass in the invention of tradition, because Fournier first constructed an intellectual genealogy. He harked back to the 1838 Abergavenny Eisteddfod and the 1867 Congress Celtique that had been held in Brittany. So he gave the Pan-Celts an associational history with its own ceremonial provenance. The Congress was pitched as another link in the Celtic historical chain, an event which would, quote, whose memory will endure as long as the race itself. So he made these things last, or, he gave these things a sense of ceremonial legitimacy by resurrecting this, two earlier traditions, the blowing of the Hurlas horn, which as far as I know had started in 1838 or 1839 with Villemarquet in Abergavenny. And of course there's, the Gorseth ceremony that is essentially placed at the beginning of the Pan-Celtic ceremonies. But in my favorite bit of Pan-Celtic kabuki, Fournier had the honorary president of the Pan-Celtic movement read an address that had been translated into Old Irish. Now the president, a man named Lord Castletown, couldn't read Old or Modern Irish. So this was actually a shrewd maneuver bypassing his linguistic deficiencies. Because as Fournier wrote to him privately, quote, "Nobody knows how it was really pronounced." But publicly, Fournier justified this as the version of the language that had been spoken before, Irish and Scots Gaelic had split. So this was an appeal to unity in historical memory. Fournier's own unique contribution was the thing on the right, the Lia Canale, the stone pillar that would only be erected when members from all nations were present. And this first Congress was a great success. Even Yeats thought so. And in 1904, Pan-Celtic Congress in Wales reportedly drew 10,000 people, including David Lloyd George. And the final Congress occurred in Edinburgh in 1907. But by then the movement was kind of foundering. I don't have a slide for the next thing. But basically, while the Congresses were an integral part of the Pan-Celtic agenda and the sort of spectacle that was needed for the movement to gain notoriety, there was a much deeper ideology than either contemporaries or other historians have assumed. I've highlighted the importance of race, but Pan-Celticism even had its own history of international relations. So Fournier basically believed that imperialism was obviously precluding an international order and was actually an international version of feudalism, with the smaller nations, the smaller Celtic nations, enthralled to their larger neighbors. So he urged the Pan-Celtic Federation that he envisioned to work together with the smaller nations of South America, with the Balkans, Sweden, Norway, the smaller nations of Europe, in a, quote, League of Small Nations. Now, Fournier's blueprint was obviously not drawn from anything particularly Celtic, but from contemporary science fiction, especially H.G. Wells's 1901 work, Anticipations. So science and technology, Fournier thought, would help to ensure an international democracy of nations, particularly the advent of air power and bombing. Wells published this text over the course of 1901, and Fournier responded to it. And then Wells actually added a footnote in this work that he was publishing serially, where he sort of ridiculed the Pan-Celts and what he called the modern obsession with race. He criticized, quote, Pan-Celticism and other pan this and that movements, and said that the racial principle they were based on was bogus. And Fournier responded in an editorial, essentially saying, look, this is a liberal racialism. This isn't a sort of, exclusive racism. We're sort of, it's a broad tent, basically. But my point here is that Fournier used Wells's ideas to form a pan-Celtic version of world government. And so the point is that any approach that looks to Celticism or Pan-Celticism at this time and only thinks of the reception of earlier, legitimate Celtic materials, it's sort of inadequate to understanding how Celticism evolved from a scholarly interest into a cultural activity that united people from different nations who spoke different languages, and how they might have envisioned a common future together. So just to conclude, my angle is basically that Celticism is best understood as a phenomenon in European intellectual and cultural history, in which scholarship and the pursuit of knowledge was in constant tension with patriotic priorities and loyalties to region, to nation, to culture or language. And these are sort of the two poles that shape Celticism. It's, the advancement of scholarship, to think Whiggishly for a second, and it's one's identity and personal loyalties and attachments. And this isn't comprehensible purely through methodological shifts in scholarship, but also not through modern analytical theories of invented traditions or center periphery anthropological models. Different sources were discovered and analyzed over time, and the popular conception of the Celts that emerged in each period aligned with the major intellectual, social, and cultural needs of that time. So this paper obviously only scratches the surface of many important areas, but I hope I've convinced you of the fruitfulness of this approach. So thank you for your time and patience.
Thank you very much, Ian. Many thanks indeed for that whistle-tops tour, really, through your books and through your book, and presenting your thoughts and your analysis across a very vast period of history, and also, a broad multidisciplinary approach to that analysis too. I'm sure, as you mentioned in your talk, we have several Celticists in the seminar this evening. We have a lot of people who've studied various periods in history in which you've focused on this evening. I'm sure that we will have comments and questions. People can ask their questions or make their comments themselves by putting their microphones on or putting their cameras on too, or equally, if people prefer, they can put them in the chat. So I'm looking around now to see if I have any immediate comments or any immediate questions. I have a few hands going up. Perhaps I'd like to invite my colleague, Professor Marianne Constantine, to make a few remarks, please. Marianne.
Diolch, Ellen. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Ian. Diddorol dros ben. That was really interesting. I don't know if we can see you. Could you jump out of your PowerPoint? Because
sorry.
There we go.
Is this better?
Lovely, yeah. Just to say thank you, because as somebody who is much more comfortable working at the micro level with very small groups of people talking to each other, it's incredibly helpful to have people like yourself who can see the big picture and who can give us those strong patterns and show us how they move through the zeitgeist of each century and of each movement, and how notions of Celticity shift with the politics of the time. So I think you're doing really important work here. A couple of things particularly got me going. I didn't really know about J.G. Pritchard as being a kind of key figure in all this, and was delighted to hear that he's in some ways part of the Iolo Circle and the Bristol South Wales movement. And I do wonder whether it might be worth ferreting a bit more in the Iolo manuscripts if you ever have time and are brave enough, because there's an awful lot in there about word lists, about comparative material, and that kind of excitement of feeling that your own language might be connected to the other side of the world, of course, is central to Iolo's view of the world himself there. And I think, in a way, Pritchard probably got overlooked because the title of that book looks like just another zany publication from the early 1800s, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. So I think it's really important to understand that in this period of everybody mucking in with their crazy ideas, out of that you crystallize things which we then build on and which become the standard narrative of the subject. So thank you for reclaiming figures from a period that I tend to think of everybody as on their hobby horses and rushing off. And then the other thing I really liked was the importance of positioning individuals by biography, religion, class, as well as nation, and to split up those binaries is absolutely crucial. And I think that's where people like ourselves working more at the coalface with small groups of people can offer you lots of different examples of some of the bigger types that you've pulled out here. And I'd just like to flag up work that's currently being done in the Centre de Recherche Bretonne et Celtique, which you probably know about. But Franche Postic has been sending me bits of the letters of Charles de Gaulle, the uncle of the politician, which are absolutely bang on the money for what you're talking about here. Him writing in kind of Cod Welsh to La Ville Marquée about how they're going to boost the Celtic movement. Some wonderful, wonderful stuff about to go online there, which I think you may find interesting. So just diolch yn fawr iawn eto. It was a really interesting talk, and I'll follow up a few things about the 1838 Eisteddfod with you, because I've got some fun things there as well. Diolch.
Well, thank you so much. It's really, really nice of you to say. And I mean, I'm not kidding. It's really kind of intimidating to give a paper to this group because, you know, I'm American. I don't have much skin in the game. And, you know, so, you know, I'm trying to treat all of these subjects with the respect that they deserve. And also with the rigor that they deserve. So I really appreciate you saying that. And with Pritchard, he's actually the judge of some of the essay contests in some of the early Abergavenny Eisteddfod. And I mean, perhaps I could follow up with you about you know sending some of his letters there, because he's trying to essentially make what he sees as Welsh antiquarianism scientific. And I think that's where sometimes we get into trouble, but you know, if we treat these things in paradigms of like Enlightenment romanticism, like Pritchard isn't, he attends the University of Edinburgh at the outset of the 19th century. He's steeped in Enlightenment thought, but at the same time, he doesn't really, he sees value in ancient Celtic culture in the way that lots of Enlightened figures from Scotland don't. And so it's important to peer below these wider angles, or sorry, paradigms, as you say sometimes. And yes, I remember I've read some of, I think, de Gaulle's letters in the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth, where he's writing in Welsh to I think maybe are they in the John Rhys papers? I couldn't read Welsh at the time, so I took photos of them and moved on, but maybe it's time to revisit those. But yeah, thank you for those suggestions, and it'd be great to follow up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks. We have the National Librarian with us this evening, Peter Croeso. Can I ask Alderic Blom to present your question?
Yes, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody, and good evening, Ian. Thank you very much. That was, as I expected, a very, very interesting paper. And like Marianne just now, I was also very much struck by the importance of Pritchard, who, apart from the 1831 publication, was, yes, also somebody I sort of overlooked, I think. But what you say is that in the 1815 article, he compares Celtic mutations with Sanskrit Sandhi, for example. That's really rather interesting in 1815, I would say. But the main question is, I would like to ask is, what can you tell us about the method that he used? Because you showed us some of these tables and comparing numerals or personal pronouns. That's not particularly novel. It is, if you look at people like Rusk, it's of course the rigor of these permutations, right, and the regularity of these things. So, I mean, how does he go about it? And in what, because putting tables next to each other, as Marianne just said, lots of people are doing that, right? So what, I mean, he came to the right conclusions, but how did he do it? Can you say a little bit more there?
Sure. It's a great question, and unfortunately, his Celtic work within that article is only a fleeting, it's only a few pages, and within a wider discussion of the Indo-European family that he's interested in at the time. But I mean, basically what he does grammatically is he looks at the conjugation of to be, basically, and in Welsh, in Sanskrit, I think he does 6 languages of, sorry, I don't have the paper to hand, but I think he does 6 languages, which, I think for 1815, without any German influence, is pretty interesting. I think the thing is, he had read Friedrich Schlegel.
Because that would be my next question. Has he read the 1809? Because that gives you the method, more or less, doesn't it? That would be very interesting.
Yeah, but so then obviously the problem with Friedrich Schlegel is that he doesn't, discuss the Celtic languages. So, because Pritchard never published the work that he said he was going to, we'll never know. But I think what we know now is a little bit more that he was on the right track much earlier than previously we thought.
Yeah, well, you've clearly convinced me of that, and I thank you for it.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Rhys Kaminsky-Jones, gai wahodd ti roed dy sylw neu dy gwestiynau?
You're muted.
Is that coming through?
Yes.
Okay. So I really enjoyed the paper. Thanks very much for that. And this is a question sort of slightly coming out from conversations that we've had with one another. But there seemed to be a hint in your paper that you were maybe offering a kind of broad angle version of Celticism that contrasts with Malcolm Chapman's still influential version, in the sense that he basically defines Celticism as being a kind of peripherality, and that peripherality is absolutely central to any conception of Celticism from antiquity forward. And is there a sense in which you're sort of writing deliberately against Chapman in that sense, that like Celtic is conceived of as something that is central to Europeanness, especially in the very early period when sort of French and German scholars are competing over the claim to Celticism? And is that a deliberate reframing against Chapman that you're doing, or something that's just coming out from the margins?
Thanks for your question, Reese. It's good to see you. I mean, I appreciate Chapman's study to a certain extent because he was the first, well, yeah, he really took the modern idea of the Celts very seriously. Even though I think, yeah, this model doesn't work at all to explain it. I mean, that's the sense in which I'm writing against him. I mean, I really identify as a historian and quite like a cranky historicist historian. So, I mean, that's really my point in, in going against Chapman, is that, we should be empiricists. But I think now that you mention it, I mean, that Franco-German dispute, I think, is so important in the history of Celticism, because what we who live in Britain and England tend to do is to think that this sort of, the dynamics are between England and the Celtic nations in Britain and Ireland, and between England and France. And now, but that just isn't the way that French thinkers thought, throughout this time. I mean, French thinkers are positioning themselves against the Germanic, first principalities and then Germany. And they're also positioning themselves against the papacy in Rome. And so those disputes about French antiquity, national origins are, I mean, that Franco-German context is really how you need to understand those, and not just the simply, the insular Celts. So, I mean, I guess I am writing against Chapman, even though I didn't sort of think of it in that sense. But and then I'm not against, I'm not writing against other people by stressing that context. I'm just saying, this is a way of appreciating how certain ideas then happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Sorry, that wasn't very clear.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Katarina Mirek, would you like to present your question or your comment?
Katarzyna Gmerek from Poland.
Okay.
Excuse me, I am without camera today.
No problem.
I am interested in PanCeltic movement. I didn't know that it would be so interesting, Ian, so I didn't, well, anyway, I wrote about Alfons Parczewski, who took part in the PanCeltic movement, not because of interest for linguistics, but because of activity defending the Slavonic languages in Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. So he was so interested that in Carnarvon, I can't pronounce it properly, presented paper in 1904, a survey of the language map of Europe and a sketch of an international peace union for the protection of linguistic minorities. So for years he corresponded with, for instance, Fournier, Dalp, and with other Celtic activists, joined many societies like the Society for the Preservation of the Irish Language, and so he was even awarded a honorary title of Bard in Dublin in 1901. We're still not sure of his bardic name because he probably wrote it down improperly, but we think it was, how is a Paul in Welsh? It is Puel or something like that. So by me, it was something like that. Anyway, I wanted to ask Ian if, Ian, you said that there is a family archive of Fournier Dalbe. I was wondering if any papers of Parczewski, any correspondence, exchange of letters might be there. And is there any possibility to learn about this? And anyway, I wanted to say that it was very, very interesting. I was eagerly listening to you, watching what was not known to me. Not everything was written in the recent book you mentioned of the Irish scholar who spoke about Ireland and Wales in his publication, but didn't mention just the Slavonic activist who participated in the PanCeltic meetings. There was a book on PanCeltic meetings, but a German scholar, I think I can't remember her name, but she presented this as a purely ornamental, purely exclusive meeting of gentlemen who were enjoying themselves in their long robes and listening to harps and so on. But in fact, it was also about protecting linguistic minorities, fighting for the language and culture. Mm-hmm. So we'll be glad if it will comment for a bit, Jan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Alphonse, I'll mispronounce that, but Parzewski. So to answer the question about the Fournier archive, no, I don't think there is a letter from Parzewski, but I will have a double check through the inventory just to check. But he did publish an article in, or anyway, his speech to the Celtic Association was reported, I think, in 1901 too. But I think the collaboration of Parzewski with the Pan-Celts is a sort of sign of this international, this question around 1900, how do you oppose an empire if you're in a small nation? And at a time when, basically Pan-Slavism and Pan-Germanism had become quite strong, had become strong forces, obviously you sort of look to that. And this is where Fournier's German education really comes into play, because he goes to a gymnasium in Düsseldorf where, Humboldt's new humanism is the sort of philosophy underpinning the curriculum. So he is drilled in classical languages from the time he's really young. And so he's really convinced about language families encompassing some sort of quality the sort of almost, the transcendental cultural quality that really ties these peoples together. And he reports quite often on what's going on between Germany, actually, and Poland, because he's very concerned about the small nations of Europe. But much more beyond that, I'm afraid I can't really say, because it's been a long time since I worked on this part of the book. But thank you so much for your questions and comments.
Thanks very much for this.
Excellent, thank you very much. John Cook, my colleague at Caux here, would you like to present your question, John?
Yes, hello, thank you. I hope you can hear me. I very much like that. Thank you, Ian Stewart. That was a lot of new things for me there, and new things about things I had thought about for many years. I think we should first say, as an American, I think sometimes that perspective is helpful, in that not that you come in without baggage, but you come in without the same baggage to these problems is an interesting, sometimes gives you unique and new perspective on things. One thing that you're mentioning Pritchard in and his role in discovering the status of Celtic as an Indo-European language, I've often wondered about this. This strange delay, the prolonged time that it took after this very broad hint that William Jones made in Calcutta in 1786. You'd think he'd almost sort of handed it to the philologist to put two and two together quickly. And I think that the thing is that not just, that's interesting in and of itself that it took so long, and it's good to understand sort of the background to that and why there was resistance and who these actual resistors are that have, and they're not completely unknowns, that they're actually important people in historical philology. But there are long-term consequences from that, and that the concept that Celtic is somehow different from the other Indo-European languages, that it's hard to see that it's related to the other Indo-European languages, is sort of baggage that's still with us, and it tells us, for example, it's generated this idea that, well, maybe Celtic is so different because one idea that was current when I was a student years ago was that because it's more archaic than the rest of them, that it's somehow left Indo-European before the rest of them, or there's a substratum that it's been very influenced by another non-Indo-European language or languages that were spoken in Britain and Ireland, in those Celtic languages in particular, rather than the continental ones before the Indo-Europeans came to Britain and Ireland. And so it's generated these the delay in recognizing it as Indo-European. And I think there's sort of voices in the wilderness at the same time who've been saying, well, it really isn't that different from the other Indo-European languages. And these are kind of phantom ideas that are with us. But nonetheless, the particular part of the history of ideas you were talking about, I think is important to unraveling all of these problems, because it is still very much with us, the concept of the differentness and kind of that it's somehow not going to ever quite be like Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and Germanic in telling us, in being a full member of the family, that it's astray somehow from the rest of it. And yet this is more of a history of ideas problem than an actual linguistic problem, I think, or at least that's the way I tend to look at it. And I think this has helped me understand this a little better. So thank you very much again.
Oh, thank you. Cheers. So I would just say with Pritchard, sure, he's a great linguist, and he's, when it comes to studying languages, he's an empiricist, but he's also committed Christian, and his overall intellectual project is proving the unity of mankind. And then, so he's working from a deductive position too, that, I'd be dishonest not to talk about, but, so that, I think that reiterates my point about, studying these people within the ideas of their time, essentially. But I think the main problem with Celtic for staying adrift for so long was that the quote unquote Celtomaniacs, I think like people like John Pinkerton, Konrad Maltebrun, and A.W. Schlegel, like, were all Celtophobes, certainly Pinkerton and Maltebrun, and they were influenced by, ancient, the sort of ancient Gothic character of Europe, certainly Pinkerton and Maltebrun. But Schlegel, I think, responded to Celtomania so badly that it completely warped his reason, and he was unable to sort of see the merits of these arguments until Pictet essentially forced him into a really embarrassing mea culpa. And yeah, I guess I suppose the sort of sense of adriftness remained because Celtic had a late start. The people who spoke those languages were dwindling, and it was such a battle to get it to be studied seriously in universities, and frankly still is. So yeah, but thank you so much for your comment.
Yeah, thanks. We have one other hand up here, possibly our last comment or question of the evening, unless we see some other takers too, and that's Hugh Jones.
Thank you very much. I hope it's not half thought out if it's the last question. Thank you so much for that paper. That was really enjoyable. You covered so much ground. I think, like many, I'm very much looking forward to the book. And obviously this really impressive work unpicking these intellectual history case studies was fantastic. I'm wondering from a slightly different angle, how do you think the development of Celticism in Ireland, Scotland and Wales related to the 18th and 19th century British state in that particular kind of context? Is this partly about the experiences of the state that people would have had, which obviously would have been impacted by gender, class, language and so on? And then also, perhaps I should say I'm a medievalist, so this isn't really my specialism, but the kind of complex functionality of the Celtic in British ideology or English ideology. I'm thinking about the time that I picked up a 1910 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and the entry on civilization attributes the success of the British nation to the slow intermingling of Anglo-Saxon and Celtic blood. So it's this really complex work that it's doing sometimes. Perhaps like maybe one small appendix question, was Celticism ever something imposed rather than claimed? But again, a fantastic paper. I really enjoyed. Sorry for just the barrage of thoughts.
Wow.
It's great. Thank you so much. Okay, so your first point about the British state. I mean, Celticism, I mean, obviously in sort of as the Union comes together, you know, through the various important dates, I mean, Celticism plays no role whatsoever in that. You know, various politicians have the opposite of respect for any of these Celtic cultures. And I mean, which is why I sort of think it's really interesting that you'll see, you know, normally probably a London-based commentator refer to the non-English nations as, oh, the Celt, like, I mean, I just read this in a review in the LRB today. Ferdinand Mount has a letter, has an article about the fiscal composition of the British state and how that worked over time. And he has a throwaway line like, oh, you know, the English, the sort of, you know, the right-leaning English would get shot of the Celts if they could. And Simon Jenkins has a book coming out. He published a really terrible article in The Guardian a few months ago that Reese and I joked about. But, you know, he's framing this in terms of the English, the British state as in, you know, the sort of English core, and he speaks quite openly of the Celts, which to me is really interesting because there's no consideration of the Celts or Celticism or anything when the Union comes together at various points. So the fact that it's sort of still hovers in political discourse as this kind of shorthand with which to sort of, I don't know, think about these peoples that are, yeah, technically connected to us in the same state and nation, but that are sort of ancillary is, I don't know, it really annoys me, and also obviously thinks it's the wrong way to think about these sort of wider political questions. So that's, I guess, more of a complaint and a rant than an answer. But the second point about the sort of amalgamation of races is really common in the second half of the 19th century, especially once Matthew Arnold reshapes Celticism, I think, because he's responding in the context of the 1860s to unrest in Ireland. And he says, actually, it's the different qualities of the Celt that have helped the sort of steady, plodding, boring Saxon to sort of rise to newer heights, because the Celts are dreamers and emotional and that, you know, all those sorts of stereotypes. So by the end of the 19th century, as I was saying, those views about what makes the British state and civilization, I guess, successful are increasingly common. And in high-minded publications like you would find in the Encyclopedia Britannica, and as a professor of poetry at Oxford would have it, you know, I think racial hybridization becomes common in a way that the sort of lower use of the rhetoric of Celticism takes a lot longer to sort of filter out, you know, the language of national character and that kind of thing. But whereas, you know, the scientific consensus on Celticism is basically, in terms of a Celtic race that's immutable, is out the window by the end of the 19th century, mostly. And actually that's, you know, a sort of early Celtoskeptic, proto-Celtoskeptic debate, because these sociologists come along and say, we can't just talk about the Celts as if they're this one unchanging people. And that caused an entire reconceptualization of things. I'll stop talking now. And was Celticism ever imposed? Not in the so-called Celtic nations today, but I think in France, there is an encouragement to think about it as a Celtic nation, especially once Ernest Lavis, who published these famous textbooks in the Third Republic. You know, this is where the phrase "Nos ancêtres les Gaulois," our ancestors the Gauls, becomes sort of a national mantra. And because of the universal aspirations of sort of French ideology at this time, you could be growing up in Northern Africa or in the Pacific and learn about your ancestors, the Gauls, from these uniformitarian textbooks. So that's the only sort of case I can think. Sorry, that was really long-winded, but hope it made sense.
No, thank you so much.
Thank you to Hugh too for your question and your comments. We do have a final question from or comments from Peter Wakeling.
Thank you very much, Ellen. I'm sorry, I'm terrible at thinking of my question after mulling it over until right at the end, and so I'll make it quick. My particular interest in the visual culture and architecture and painting and sculpture, and you've given a fantastic intellectual background to some of the thinking that might have filtered into visual culture. But in my experience, very often architects and artists are not necessarily plugged in any sense directly to those those kinds of arguments, and yet something filters through to them that creates an interest and a moment of excitement in working in a new influence. And I just wondered if you'd seen connections yourself between visual artists and architects and the movement that you've been studying.
Thanks, Peter. I'm sorry, but this is probably going to be a really disappointing answer, but not really. But that's probably a failure of my own to sort of dig into the artistic side of things enough. I mean, I suppose, like, you know, sort of Celtic crosses and so-called Celtic art becomes popular after, I think after, you know, the Latin discovery in the 1850s. And these things become tied together towards the end of the 19th century and are probably seen in some of the famous paintings that I'm blanking on the title of now. But another thing would be, frankly, that, you know, I think some artists do definitely read texts, or art historians do anyway, because the statue of Boudica that's on Westminster Bridge is the result of, obviously, a basis in classical sources. But it's been proven by Martha Van Dry that this particular artist in the end of the 19th century was consulting antiquarian sources from the 17th century of what Boudica might have looked like. And so I think that's the best I can really do, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Well, thank you very much. Look out for more.
Absolutely. No, thanks very much. I mean, you started your talk looking at the popular attitudes and ideas and the modern manifestations of Celticism, and I'm just thinking now of Peter's question in terms of what we see today happening in what we might call northern Spain, Galicia, Asturias, that region, or those regions where it's certainly something artistic, or it's the iconography, isn't it, of Celticism that we see manifesting itself in I suppose sort of popular attitudes or popular identities linked to Celticism, rather than any kind of sort of philological or an ethnography or an ethnology as approaches there. So I don't know what do you make of those kinds of manifestations or Celtic identities happening in that part of the world?
It's a great question, and it's obviously something I try to avoid because it is a tough question. But I think probably the answer is that, like everything else, is that culture is historically sort of contingent, and what counts as culture or cultural affinity, changes over time. So, I mean, this is why, frankly, PanCelticism that it exists now isn't based on race anymore. I mean, even though someone, that might have been celebrated in the 19th century, maybe today these, Celtic fellow feeling can be based on a voluntaristic idea of culture, art, language, if you have it and you're interested. Yeah, I think that would be my answer. So if a future historian is writing on late 20th, early 21st century Celticism, they would have to, position ideas of Celtic culture within a history of what culture is, especially because cultural history is the predominant paradigm of historical study that I think we are in and have been in for the last 3 decades. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's probably, that will.
Sorry, Ellen, you muted yourself.
No, I think that will probably be the case when people look at this period in history at the end, as you say, the end of the 20th century, early 21st century. You know, we have Galicia as a member of the Celtic Media Festival. Mm-hmm. You know, it's also part of that similar sense of a voluntary belonging to another coalition, if you like. So yeah, I think you know, trying to create a center within the peripheries. I think that, yeah, those are the kinds of ideas that will probably shape somebody looking at this period, and how the Celtic identities and the Celtic nations, if you like, or the Celtic ideology continues in this period that we're living in now. But we've had several comments in the chat during this seminar this evening, Ian, all of them saying how much that they've appreciated your paper and how much you've made people think about things that they hadn't thought in that same way before, people having to leave before the end of the discussion. But I think that the fact that we're still here having a conversation at, you know, 6:30 shows the appreciation that has been manifested this evening and how much people have enjoyed your talk. And also, I think it's really interesting for us to be, you know, going to read some of your publications, things that you've written already, and everybody, I suppose, looking forward to the publication of your book and knowing that that will make a substantial impact on the field of study. So I'd really like to thank you on behalf of everyone this evening for your wonderful seminar. Diolch yn fawr iawn I ti. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the conveners and the audience. Thanks, I really appreciate it.
Great, thanks.